Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's finally time for the year-end list. The top 10 best albums of 2020. So, 2020 wasn't all bad, was it? I mean, for the world and humanity at large, yes, it absolutely was, even speaking as someone whose personal life wasn't majorly affected by the many world-shifting events that went on in these crazy 12 months. I mean, come on. A global pandemic, widespread police brutality, me losing so much motivation and making the annual Todd ripoffs that I decided to stop making them altogether. All tragedies on the exact same level. But there were good things in this year, right? Things that made this year stand out in an actual good way. For instance, this was easily the best year we've had for electronic music since I started making music reviews. I think 2020 was legit on par with 2013 when it comes to the sheer volume of quality electronic music being released, if not even surpassing it. Might need a few years to know for sure if it was actually better, but there were so many great projects that I want to keep around and be remembered. From old standards who make it on these lists all the time, to fresh faces, from people who I've never heard of before, to people who I wouldn't have even necessarily expect to stick the landing so well, let alone release something at all. This was such an astonishingly great year for electronic music that I needed to bring the Some Stuff I Missed format into full swing and do several giant roundups of mini reviews to catch myself up. 50 releases that came out in 2020 were covered in those roundups, and several of them are even making it onto this list. Both honorable mentions and proper entrance into the top 10 itself. And who knows, I'm sure there's even more out there that I never got to check out and could have been material for this list as well. Now, the interesting thing about this list is that I actually didn't lean as heavily on replay value this year as I might have before. That was a lot harder to quantify because it felt like every time I would really get into an album, I'd find a new one I hadn't heard before that would replace it, and it would happen so fast and so frequently that I didn't spend as much time coming back to projects I already reviewed. I mean, not to say that won't still come into account, just there wasn't really a No Geography or a Monsters Exist that just dominated a notable percentage of my year. Replay value was spread out a lot more equally over a lot more projects, and some of my favorite projects of the year I might have only been heavily bumping for about 2 weeks and then came back to like 3 times after that. They just left such a strong impression anyways. At the end of the day, as always, this list is pretty much just ranked by personal enjoyment at the time of editing the video, and whatever happens to feel right to me. It's just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. You should hopefully know the deal by now. Oh yeah, and the numerical scores I gave out to any of these releases don't come into account when ranking these, since opinions can always change. A solid 8 could end up above an 8.5, you never know. And only electronic albums are being considered for the list because that's what this channel is all about, you know the drill. Whatever, let's not waste any more time, let's just get right into it! The top 10 best albums of 2020! So as always, let's start out with the honorable mentions. Honorable mention number 1, Nathan Fake, Blizzards. I don't think I would have considered myself much of a Nathan Fake fan before this album came out, both because I hadn't heard any of his albums before this year and because I didn't really find any of his previous albums to be anything all that special. But he really brought something special for this one. It has to be his single strongest work to date. 2020 has been an excellent year for the genre of micro house. There were several great projects this year that aimed to strip themselves back to the barest essentials, with this project being a very well-textured and consistently engaging set of synth excursions, made up of nothing but very simple vintage-sounding analog synths and drum machines, yet also getting every track on here to really set itself apart as unique and interesting in their own right. This was even going to be an entrant into the list proper for a while, some others just ended up overtaking it. But there's still tons of great jams like Crimea Blizzard, Stepping Stones, Penchemons, Eris and Dysnomia, those latter two especially have been major growers. And plenty more. Every listen to this thing I felt like I was getting different picks for favorite tracks, and I had a ton of fun with it throughout the year. Kinda wish I'd given it a proper video breaking it down instead of just a short Some Stuff I Missed segment. But oh well, still definitely make sure you don't overlook this one yourself. Honorable mention number 2, Vale Smith, Are You Sick of Being Unlucky? Well, here we are with the second year in a row with a new Vale Smith album that had much more staying power and replay value than I expected when I reviewed it. All the criticisms I gave in my review still stand. There is a stretch of tracks in the middle of the album where my attention trails off a bit, and many of my listens throughout the year stopped somewhere around the track Hazel Clip before I would get distracted by something else and then not finish it. But I would still put on the whole thing quite frequently as well, and whenever I did I would come out really satisfied. The opening and closing stretches of this album are freaking great, and this album wins the award for best opening 5 seconds of any album in 2020. I just love that first track, Turmoil Medulla, so much, and the 4 tracks that immediately follow it while I'm at it, and the way everything in this album links together and flows so well. It may not be perfect, but it's definitely a consistently engaging experience that I highly recommend. If you're into wonky beatwork and crazy melodic sound design in the vein of early Rusty or Sam Gellatree, though still setting itself apart as its own thing apart from those artists, this is something special. Honorable mention number 3, Shy, Obscura. The Speak and Spell Records label has been doing a lot of cool and interesting stuff as of late that's really consistently pulled in my attention. The Vale Smith project probably still standing as my favorite project to come out of them this year, but this Shy project is not far behind. A tranquil ambient project with lots of chiming bells and electric pianos on every track that created a very nostalgic and sad nocturnal atmosphere that I kept wanting to come back to over the course of this year. It may be only 5 tracks and not much of an album, but the very subtle and dreamlike yet very emotional approach to this project had me pretty consistently pulled in with each track providing its own little unique spin on the sound that would keep me engaged. One of the best ambient projects of the year for sure, deserves a lot more attention than it's gotten. Honorable mention number 4, Plone, Puzzlewood. Well, this one sure stood out from the crowd this year. I only first heard this one fairly late in the year while doing that big 2-hour roundup, but an electro-acoustic album inspired by, like, little kids' toys and video games, the most overtly goofy and quirky and brightly colored thing I've heard this side of the Rhythm Heaven soundtrack, and coming from 2 old Warp Records alumni who hadn't released anything under the name since the late 90s. Came right the hell out of nowhere. While absolutely it is the kind of project that could be irritating or off-putting if I'm not in the right mood, the insane creativity and odd sound design really struck me as being totally unlike anything else I heard this year, and they have just enough lower-key breather moments to still keep things palatable and grounded, and not insufferable in its sheer quirkiness. A project this willfully bizarre and off-the-wall doesn't come around very often, and I had a ton of fun with it, so definitely make sure you give it a shot as well. Oh, and speaking of willfully bizarre and off the wall, honorable mention number 5, Matmos, The Consuming Flame, Disc 3, Extraterrestrial Masters. I only enjoyed the 3rd disc of this monstrous triple album from these experimental legends enough to give a shout on this list. The other 2/3 were very spotty and inconsistent for me, and the ending of the first third was probably the single most openly irritating musical moment of the entire year. But talk about some impressive work that Matmos pulled off with The Consuming Flame. A 3-hour album with 99 collaborators from so many various walks of life coming together for an insanely dense experience that sampled anything you might be able to think of and diverting into basically every single genre at various points. This final third, which happened to feature the likes of Mouse on Mars and One O Tricks Point Never, among many others, was by far the section of the album that came together the most effectively, directing all of its strange ideas into something that created a more palpable sense of place and environment, feeling like it could take me into some wacko alternate dimension or multiple alien planets, and got everything to coalesce together in spite of being as wildly varied and out there experimental as the first 2/3. It works fine as a standalone album as far as I'm concerned, even if it does beat the phrase, "I am an extraterrestrial master," into the ground to the point of it getting kinda irritating. And even so, the full package of this album could get a shout here just based purely on how mind-blowingly dense and impressive and creative it all is. This final third just took it to another level and became one of my favorite things Matmos have done to date. If you can make time for it, it's certainly worth the experience. Honorable mention number 6, Disclosure, Ecstasy and Energy. Yeah, Disclosure kept me coming back quite a bit this year. Call them too mainstream or whatever you like, though I really appreciate that they're not really trying to go for the obvious Billboard crossover this time around, or watering down their sound for the sake of appealing to a wider audience. Still stand by my opinion that the Ecstasy EP and Energy album need each other for the best possible experience. They're not quite enough individually. And I did come back to the EP markedly more than the album, specifically because I love the track expressing what matters. But we still got a ton of jams from these guys this year that I had a lot of fun coming back to. Watch Your Step, My High, Molly Molly, Energy, all the rest of them. Even the interludes on this album I still really like. Still hoping for them to put out a whole straight house album or do more stuff with samples. They're pretty dang good at that, but still, I'll take what we got here. Honorable mention number 7, Sounds from the Ground, Through the Ages 2. Honestly, the only reason this isn't on the list proper is because it's just a compilation of outtakes. It just goes to show the level these guys are on when these guys can just drop a bunch of random old unreleased tracks that didn't make the cut for their main albums, and still end up with a freaking great project that could have been marked as among my favorites of an already super crowded year. Even my one issue with the project, that one of the tracks was accidentally a duplicate of a main album track from 2012, was actually rectified at a different point this year when they put out one extra B-side for free on Bandcamp called Up and Away. A nice little glitchy ambient sort of thing. Wouldn't have been a huge standout had it been on the comp, but still made the switch out anyway. But man, even when these guys are just putting out a bunch of throwaways, they can still put together great spooky ambience or thumping dub grooves and even deliver cool creative ideas that expand their sound and make me keep wanting to come back for more. So long as these guys keep making music, I have a feeling they're just gonna keep showing up on these lists. Honorable mention number 8, Rival Consoles, Articulation. Alright, here was another one of the big micro house highlights of this year, also just barely missed getting on the list proper. Like Nathan Fake, Rival Consoles is an artist who I only just discovered this year, and pretty late this year thanks to a Patreon request, and then later marathoning the rest of his stuff for that 2-hour roundup. And while he's had solid albums in the past, like I.O., Kid Velo, and Persona, he's also had some really dull and or inconsistent ones. Even if I'd been paying attention to him before this year, I don't think I would have expected him to make a project that could make it onto this list. But lo and behold, Articulation is probably my favorite set of tracks he's put out to date. A super tight set of 6 tracks that still ended up feeling like an album and leaving me satisfied. The biggest strength of this project is just its melodies and chord progressions. All these tracks have a bit of a modern classical flair in the way they were constructed, which really give this project a unique flavor to set itself apart from the crowd that could really emotionally resonate with me. Tracks like Vibrations on a String and Sudden Awareness of Now may be fairly repetitive in structure, but the chord progressions alone can get these tracks to rise up to becoming, like, epic emotional experiences. And with an album this short, there's no room for error, so every track on here feels like it services the greater whole, while being the kind of thing I could possibly want to come back to out of context. Well, maybe not Still Here, but that one doesn't weigh down the pacing and I don't skip it while listening to this whole project. Still, this was a stellar piece of work, definitely worth highlighting as among my favorites of 2020 overall. Honorable mention number 9, The Orb, Abolition of the Royal Familia. Ooh boy, this was a weird one for me this year. When it came out, I thought it was great nearly from start to finish. Then later in the year, my enjoyment of it slowly fell off as I started to think this was really lame and not up to their usual standards. Probably after seeing the music video for Days, which is one of the most horrifyingly lame things that's ever existed. For a while, I wasn't even planning on mentioning this on the list and might have even marked it as a big disappointment in retrospect. And then I came back to it earlier this month, and then suddenly it all grew back on me again, and my old opinion for my review was restored. I still don't think this album is as strong as other similarly wild and goofy trips of theirs like The Dream or No Sounds Are Out of Bounds, and don't think they're doing anything game-changing, and the album did not remotely deliver on the promise of its title. But heck with it, I still had a lot of fun with it all the same. The ambient stuff is appropriately immersive, the dub reggae stuff, as cheesy as it is, still sounds great and pulls me in, and especially the disco stuff in the opening stretch is excellent. House of Narcotics especially stands out to me as among some of their best work. And sure, it may be lame and goofy, and the overlong subtitles on every track are kind of obnoxious, but you know what, the music is still good, and the Orb bring a baseline level of flair and creativity that I'm always going to be able to get into. And, it's still lame and goofy in a way that they can own and still make fun to listen to. I will perfectly understand if this one left you underwhelmed or annoyed, but nah, I still think it's easily good enough to get a shout out here. And yeah, those are all the honorable mentions that I felt like writing about, and I wanted to cut this list off somewhere, but given how ridiculously stacked this year was with solid releases, I'll give you guys a whole bunch more picks that could have also been honorable mention material in less crowded years, and are just as worth giving a shot. Sick of that joke, but I couldn't resist. You should still check out that last album and support your boy. I'm pretty proud of my work there and going to continue hawking it in 2021. But anyway, let's get to the list proper. Number 10. Mewjuice, Rita Moskva. In this year chock full of great microhouse projects, I needed to put something in that vein on the list proper. And it was a very close run between this album, Nathan Fake's Blizzard's, and Rival Council's Articulation for this spot. Blizzard's was the best of these from a textural standpoint, getting its deceptively straightforward arrangements to have the most easily recognizable identity. Articulation was the best from a melodic and chord progression standpoint, getting major emotional resonance out of track ideas that could have otherwise been really run-of-the-mill and boring. Rita Moskva may not be better than those albums in those particular departments, texturally very plain and melodically not the most exciting or evocative, but where it does excel above the other two is just being an absolute masterwork of pacing. I was particularly wowed by how it managed to consistently pull in my attention while doing so little to draw in your attention on the surface level. It doesn't feel like there's a single wasted note or beat or measure. Every sound builds into the next so perfectly and can get every minor detail to feel like it had a well-defined purpose and direction. Even if it peaks a little early with the second track, KTO being the easy standout, all 8 of them have really consistently hit for me. It kind of ended up becoming the benchmark release for Microhouse that I would keep mentally comparing similar projects to, and probably just became the project in this style that I actually listened to the most this year. The kind of project where I may not have really had much of anything to say or break down when covering it in the August roundup, but certainly not because of a lack of interest, more because its immaculate, minimal construction felt like it spoke for itself. And it's only been growing on me more and more since then. I admittedly have yet to hear any of Mewjuice's previous albums and wouldn't be able to tell you how well this fits into the greater context of his back catalog, but this still was a definite standout in 2020 that kept me coming back quite a bit and felt like it was expanding my horizons. Not many people talking about it, so make sure you don't let it go overlooked yourself. Number 9. False Noise, Floral Strobe. Another fresh face on the list, and not one I see many people talking about. Well, False Noise has been around for a few years, putting out EPs and singles and the like. He appeared on some of my favorite tracks on my number 2 album of last year. I'd known he existed for a while now, but this was his first full-length studio album, and goddamn what an impressive debut. This project is a super abrasive and balls-to-the-wall energy rush with loads of blasting synths and brightly colored melodies and textures, super rhythmically complex and dense. Seemingly every single second is doing something exciting that's different from the second that came before it. Okay, it's not that fast-paced and off-the-wall. Tracks still find plenty of groove and cohesive identity, but man, this project is pure sensory overload in the best possible way. Every track is packed with so much vibrant detail and never feels so overbearing that I ever get sick of it. It was one of the most fun highlights of the first half of this year, and if it's passed under your radar, make sure you remedy that at your earliest convenience. Number 8. Monolake, Archaeopteryx. Man, what a treat it was to randomly get a surprise 95-minute, 19-track project from Monolake completely out of the blue this year, and it turns out to be some of his best stuff in years. Rob Henke has no shortage of quality atmospheric techno over many decades. Even some of his weakest stuff like Ghosts could theoretically make it onto a respective year-end list. But Archaeopteryx was such a treasure trove of top-tier techno. No, this album didn't need to be 95 minutes, and probably could have been stronger with cutting down, but I'm not going to complain about getting more Monolake. It's not like this album had any major weak spots or moments that couldn't give me something special to enjoy. Even if a track wouldn't stand out, it would always retain the same kind of chilling metallic atmosphere that runs through all Monolake projects and I'll always enjoy. Also, the melodies would pop out a lot more on each track and create this sense of heightened drama and emotion that not all of his projects effectively pull off. But the tracks that did really stand out, damn, they were so good. The strikingly bubbly and uplifting atmosphere of Fein non Ono, the gurgling and menacing vocal processing on Urk's Argle, the abrasive synth blasts of Sync Response, the dense seas of metallic teching and clanging on Clockwork, Fatigue, and Plateau Orthogonal, the sharp melodic lines which strangely become happier as they go on Direct Onyx, the crisp bass lines and text-to-speech voices on Espace Fourier, and especially the progressions of melancholy pianos building into much stranger and darker territory on Orbit Incomplete, just to name a few highlights. Admittedly, kinda expected this to rank higher on my list than it actually did. The length may have gotten to me on some more recent listens, but there's still so much goodness throughout this project that it had to be on here somewhere. Absolutely worth the effort of digging into, if you ask me. Though, if you want a project that had a somewhat similar vibe and pulled it off even better, albeit with a very different approach. Number 7. Rob Clouth, 0 Points. This obviously is one of the most recent additions to the list, only discovered it thanks to that last massive roundup right near the end of the year, but my god is it on another freaking level. Like the False Noise thing, this is yet another gigantic trip through tons of hyper-detailed modern IDM of varying rhythms and construction that still comes together as a complete piece, but where Floral Strobe was much more in-your-face and brightly colored and abrasive in its approach, 0 Points is a lot more subtle and laid back. And it is drop-dead gorgeous all the way through. Lots of rhythmically complex experimental arrangements that can go up against muted synth melodies and emotional piano performances that always create this astronomical sense of space and 3D stereo depth, inspired by concepts of chaos theory and, of course, 0 Point energy, the idea that even in a complete vacuum it's impossible for there to be literally zero energy in a given space, so the near non-existent energy field creates a pattern of randomness that plays into lots of different details throughout the project. And that somehow doesn't stop it from resonating on an emotional level as well. At no point does this project feel like it's trying to be a technical achievement for its own sake. The final effect isn't far off from something like John Hopkins' Insides. It's an absolutely incredible listen, and possibly the single most technically impressive entrant into this list. As for why it's not higher, I suppose the intro is a little dull. I tend to just skip right to track 3 whenever I put this on. But, I mean, that's being nitpicky. Mainly there were other projects that got more emotional resonance out of me. For instance. Number 6. BT, The Lost Art of Longing. Yep, surprise, ever seen this guy show up on one of my lists before? Might again be more surprising that he's not even higher up. In one breath, I felt like weirdly in the minority of people who enjoyed this album as much as I did. I've seen a lot of people talking about finding it to be a letdown, and I guess I can kinda see where those people are coming from. I don't think it's his best produced album ever, for instance. It can feel a little cold and metallic and blown out in comparison to some of his previous projects, and not as texturally imaginative as some of his others as well. But, nah, I stand by this project being freaking great, up to the high standards that I would expect any BT album to have. It actually kind of reminds me of that last Hybrid album, Light of the Fearless. That album was also very overproduced, but not to such an extent that I couldn't still pick up on how detailed the sound design was, or thought it took away from their unique style, and the core tunes behind everything were so good that they could do most of the heavy lifting on their own. Same deal here. There may be no single track on this album as incredible as Hybrid's Light Up, but this is still one of BT's most consistent projects, even in the weakest moments, mostly in the second half. There's always plenty of catchy tunes that have plenty of emotion behind them that can get me to sing along with them, and the best moments here just exemplify everything I enjoy in BT's most commercial material. The sprawling 10-minute journeys of Walk Into the Water and Weltanschauung, the expansive and watery progressive house of 1 AM in Paris, the insane detail and subtle experimentation on Never Odd or Even, the strange shifting structures of The War and The Light Is Always On, still retaining among the catchiest tunes on here, emotional gut punches like Wildfire or Save Me. There's just so much great stuff here. There may be a clunker here or there like I Will Be Yours or If I Can Love You Right, and honestly I'm really on and off for No Warning Lights too. This album is definitely front-loaded, but even these weakest moments still give me plenty to enjoy. BT may have projects that impress me more than this or hit greater heights, but that doesn't mean his passion didn't still totally show through on every moment on this thing. I will get it if this wasn't your thing, but this was yet another big highlight of the year for me, as BT albums always tend to be, and I loved all of it. If this was only number 6, that just goes to show how strong a showing 2020 had for electronic music. But speaking of artists with regular showing on my year-end lists... Number 5. One-O-Trix Point Never. Magic One-O-Trix Point Never. Hey look, got the t-shirt. Since this album cover gives me eye strain, I'll try to keep this quick. Daniel Lopatin has been one of my favorite artists of the past decade for how much he's continued to push the boundaries of electronic music and put out several insane classic projects of crazy experimentalism. Every album he put out in the first half of the decade were year-end list picks for the year they came out. This project may be no less weird and out there and abstract and strange as all his other stuff, but it's one that highlights the human element at the core of all his music more than any previous project of his. A reminder that Lopatin is still just a regular guy. I recently read an interview he had where he said he was mildly insulted by people calling this project his most accessible to date. And while that did take me aback at first, I can actually kinda see what he means. This may probably be his poppiest project yet, dipping its toes into 80s power ballads and low-key synth pop and the like, alongside his usual strange ambient oddities, even featuring The Weeknd on one track. But I'll admit this wasn't an accessible listen in the traditional sense. When I first heard it, I was even kinda underwhelmed by it. I needed to listen to it many times to unlock how deep the project went, how personal it felt to him, getting each track to make sense in context and become a favorite on some level. But it got a little better with each successive listen, and now by 10th listen or however many I've given at this point, is quite possibly the most emotionally resonant project OPN has in his catalog. Biggest grower project of the entire year for me. Went from mildly pleasant to almost an outright tearjerker, from being alright to ending up in my top 5 favorites of 2020, and an absolute stunner. But speaking of projects with a lot of emotional resonance... Number 4. Rum Pistol, After the Flood. It's weird to think about. Before this year, I had no idea who Rum Pistol was, and I don't think I would have cared enough to look into him on my own time. I only did because someone paid me on Patreon to do a full series on his previous 5 albums, in that brief period when I allowed that. And even after doing the series, he did in fact have one album that I thought was great, and Dynamo, but I still mostly found his other stuff to just be alright. I certainly never would have expected one of my most listened to albums of the whole year to come from this guy. I suppose it is technically pushing it a bit to call this album electronic. Sure, Rumpistle's background may be in electronic music, and making very pleasant and inoffensive IDM type stuff, but for this project he decided he needed to start fresh and try something new in the wake of the pandemic, and ended up doing something much more in the modern classical vein. Still has some electronic tinges throughout, but every track on this thing is based around his compositions on the piano, with many other touches of acoustic instrumentation, like guitars and violins, as well as some field recording manipulations, and goddamn did it hit me like a ton of bricks. Every track conveys this sense of aching sadness and loneliness that takes me into some kind of post-apocalyptic world, like an abandoned city that's been reclaimed by nature, and I just have no freaking words for it. It is astonishing just how emotional power this project had for me, just completely swept me off my feet. I would often put this project on right before bed, much like BT's Other Side of Fear album last year, and while obviously it wasn't as sprawling or expansive as that project, it often had a similar effect on me, and did so in a much tighter running time. Needless to say, I did not expect a project like this to come along at all, but it has stuck with me on a level few others this year have. Excellent stuff. Number 3. Fortet, 16 Oceans. This feels like the moment at which 2020 became one of my favorite years for electronic music in recent memory. Maybe that was mostly in comparison to 2019, where it felt like the vast majority of the best releases didn't come in until like the very end of the year, and like the first 9 months were just really dry and disappointing. But when this dropped in March, I was like, this seems like a good omen for the state of the genre to get a project this great this early in the year. And it is absolutely held up as far as I'm concerned. I've seen a lot of mixed to lukewarm reviews of this project since, which did kind of catch me off guard even if I did feel like Fortet wasn't really pushing himself into new territory with this thing. But I don't care, I'm still calling this his best project since There Is Love in You. So many jams throughout this thing that can be danceable or energetic, or relaxing and meditative, or both at the same time. The sound design was more interesting and evocative than most of his projects he'd put out in the past decade. There was a lot more sonic variety, but still a sense of cohesiveness. Tracks like School, Baby, Insect Near Piha Beach, Romantics, 4T Recordings, and especially Teenage Birdsong have stuck with me to the point of becoming some of my favorite tracks he's ever done. And even the interludes or other tracks that might not have stuck out to me initially would show me some cool new insight into the comfy world of the album that I might not have picked up on otherwise. This is the kind of project that I often put on in the early morning, and it would actually get me to feel awake and refreshed and brighten up the rest of my day. And I hate early mornings. Now before you ask, I have heard the 2 surprise albums he put out on Christmas, Parallel and 871. They're fairly interesting, though they also feel way more like thrown together side projects, especially 871, and neither of them have the same level of focus that 16 Oceans had. This project felt like it was a lot more important and personal to Kieran Hebden, and he put a lot more effort into it in the way it all came together. Whatever the case, this was an excellent album, one that had consistent staying power throughout the year, and one I'm sure is going to continue to stick with me for years to come. Number 2. The Avalanches, We Will Always Love You. I'm sure people will be more surprised that this isn't my number 1, given it was the only 9 out of 10 I gave to a new album this year. There was one other project that might have barely crossed into 9 out of 10 territory in retrospect. Also, this album hasn't even been out for a full month yet, hasn't had the chance to get the same level of replay value that most of these other projects do, and after like 8 listens in a week I could probably stand a break from it now, but I mean, come on, it's the freaking Avalanches. I had already been prepared for this project to either be my number 1 or number 2 album of the year for several months already. And all the pre-album singles getting way too many repeat listens throughout the year meant this wasn't gonna feel like any less of a 2020 album than any of these others. And in terms of pure emotional resonance, this was easily the project that hit me the hardest all year, living up to every single one of the soaring expectations I had for it. Sure, I may technically enjoy their other 2 albums more, but this was just everything I could have possibly wanted out of a new 3rd album from them after a comparatively normal length wait, sounding different enough from the other 2 to not need a direct comparison, but still clearly coming from the same people. The way they brought together the concepts of space and our transmissions reaching out to the other side of the universe, tying into the concepts of death and tributing those we've lost, channeling long-past artists through their samples, getting tons of guest features from Denzel Curry to Jamie XX to Kurt Vile to Perry Farrell to Mick Jones to Rivers Cuomo to MGMT to Tricky and so many others, with not a single one feeling out of place and everyone fitting perfectly and adding into the overarching concept, and just the way this thing sounds, so much spacier than their last two, obviously, but still containing plenty of room for solid dance grooves and clever sample flips. So much to dig into as I want out of any Avalanche's project. If their lack of output in years previous would make me hesitate at calling them one of my all-time favorite artists, this project officially cemented them as such without any possible hesitation. So long as the Avalanches continue to put this level of love out there in the world, I feel inclined to reciprocate. But as brilliant as this album was, I felt like putting it at number 1 would be too obvious for me. And like I said, it came in a bit too late in the year for me to want it to top the list, among various other factors I mentioned earlier. So here's what I picked for the top spot instead. Number 1. Patricia Taxon, Das Triadische Ballett, Gelb, Rosa und Schwarz. Yeah, technically a three-way tie, but it's between 3 albums that are clearly meant to be gathered together in the same package, so no, that doesn't feel like cheating like the ties on my old 2015 year-end list did. Anyway, this triple album hasn't really left my listening rotation since it came out. I may not be in the mood for it every day or anything, but I've probably listened to it at least once or twice a month since it all dropped, and it's only grown on me since. The collective length has never at any point felt like too much. Some opinions have shifted since my review. I now hold each of the 3 volumes individually on the same level of personal enjoyment. Schwartz did shrink on me after I saw Patricia talking about some of the tracks on this album being like old leftovers from other albums and being the volume she put the least thought into of the 3, and I could kinda see what she meant. It felt a little less consistent as time went on. Though it is still the only one of the 3 that I've ever felt like listening to out of the full triple album context. Rosa, meanwhile, markedly grew on me. May have been the least initially surprising from a textural level, but when she's talked about that one being the one she put the most effort into, and even when I covered it, I could hear all the complexity in the arrangements and actual musical composition and the modern classical influences bleeding through, probably the volume that hits the most emotional note as well. And my opinion of Gelp is exactly the same as when I reviewed it, so yeah. As for what got this triple album above the freaking Avalanches in my personal ranking, well, I guess it's partially the same move as me ranking Comb and Duster above Sounds from the Ground in 2017. The project that gave me more to chew on intellectually, getting higher billing than the one that hit with more emotional power, and me wanting to uprate an artist that I haven't known as long. But it also kind of goes beyond that. When I listen to We Will Always Love You, I feel like sitting back in awe at it. Like, it's such a towering release that hits so hard all at once, the kind of thing that makes me think, man, the Avalanches are on such an insane level of greatness that I'll never be able to reach myself. Patricia Taxon, on the other hand, is the kind of artist who I listen to and can get me inspired to want to do better. Especially having seen her full progression as an artist, starting out as a complete nobody obscure Bandcamp artist. Just 3 years ago, she was just like a random commenter on my videos who DM'd me her surprisingly promising Winter Beats album, alongside plenty of other no-name electronic artists who didn't mean anything to me. Steadily improving her production and getting more and more impressive and more popular as the years went on over dozens of releases, getting to Pix and Bit last year where she made an EDM album that production-wise could go toe-to-toe with actual big popular EDM A-listers, and quite frankly was more interesting and fun to listen than most EDM albums I'd heard in years. And now getting to these 3 albums, her 48th, 49th, and 50th, which don't even feel like an attempt to fit into any specific scene anymore despite all the obvious EDM influences. Patricia Taxon creating an experience here that no one else but her would have been able to pull off, and exemplifies so many things that I love in electronic music without feeling like specific fan service to my taste. A product of pure passion for this genre and for making art in general. And who knows, maybe someday she'll even be able to top these and end up with a single project that ends up in 9 out of 10 territory for me more immediately, instead of 3 8 out of 10 releases that need to be packaged together and get a few months of replay value to hit the 9 level. Just saying, if an artist who started out as small as her can eventually get to the level of putting out something like Das Triadische Ballett, who knows, maybe you could as well. Always the kind of thing worth striving for, no matter how long it takes to get there. And yeah, that's the list of my favorite albums of the year. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year.